Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to this part 2 video looking at the life and death of Thomas of Becket, as well as the penance that was served by the English king at the time, Henry II. Now, you don't necessarily have to know what happened in part 1 to understand what's happening in part 2. It does stand on its own 2 feet, this video. But if you do feel like watching it, there is a link just up in this corner here, and there'll of course be a link to my channel down below. So let us get straight on and pick up the story in December 1170. Hearing these cries of raged passion, 4 knights decided to take it upon themselves to dispense out their own kingly justice. Those 4 knights: Reginald Fitzures, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Breton, travelled from the court of Henry II, which was based just outside of Bayeux in Normandy, France, and travelled 2 days across the English Channel to Dover. They arrived at Dover on the 28th of December 1170 and stayed at a place called Saltwood Castle, just outside of the main area that is Dover. And Saltwood Castle was, funnily enough, owned by a man called Ranulph de Broc, who had been one of the thorns in Thomas of Becket's side throughout his time as Archbishop of Canterbury. Ranulph de Broc had actually been excommunicated on a couple of occasions by Becket for confiscating a number of lands that had been designated as part of the Archbishop title. Ranulph de Broc was probably quite welcoming to these 4 knights, upon obviously learning what their intentions were to his political enemy. It is a good day's journey from Saltwood Castle in Dover up to the famous cathedral at Canterbury. So by the time the knights left in the early hours of the morning, they would arrive at Canterbury at some point in the early to mid-evening. It is said that the Archbishop and the clerks and pious individuals of the cathedral had just finished their dinner, and the Archbishop was retiring to his room. He was already undressed and in his knightly wear. Becket invited these 4 knights into his personal bedchamber, and whatever issues that these knights had, Becket proclaimed that they should be told in public, i.e. with all of the clerks that worked at the cathedral present in the room as well. The knights put it to Becket that what had been a symbol of peace, a kiss of peace actually, in the July of 1170 at the King's Court at Fretival, had now been broken in recent weeks and days due to the actions of Becket himself. Becket had excommunicated the Archbishop of York, the sort of second in command to the English Church, as it were, the Bishop of London, and the Bishop of Salisbury, who had apparently acted illegally and enacted an unofficial coronation for the young Prince Henry, who was supposed to be sort of de facto leader of the English lands whilst King Henry II was in Normandy in France. This had happened in the June of 1170, and despite promises at Fretival that a new coronation would be done, headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Becket, Becket had decided to excommunicate the whole lot of the clergy, Archbishop, and the other bishops involved as well. Becket argued that it wasn't actually he who made the decision to excommunicate these bishops. It was actually what he called the spiritual superior, i.e. the Pope over in Rome, who had asked for this will and justice to happen. But the knights didn't take too kindly to this particular argument, and so decided to threaten loosely the Archbishop with his life. They didn't have any armour or weapons with them at the time, hence the looseness of this particular threat. The Archbishop, up until this point, had been rather passive and calm in his arguments. But at the sign of threats, he decided to dispense out his own threats, saying that they too would be excommunicated if they didn't leave or didn't rescind their accusations of treachery. Now the knights decided that there was no hope getting through to Becket, so they left the chambers and went to go and put on their armour and grab their weapons. The monks of the cathedral throughout all of this had been panicking greatly, fearing for Becket's life. So once the knights had left, they implored their archbishop to go seek sanctuary in the main cathedral building. Becket was incredibly stubborn and didn't necessarily want to give in to the fear of this threat from these knights. But at the third time of asking, Becket eventually agreed. They positively moved towards the cathedral, but Becket was still dragging his heels a bit, giving much frustration to the monks at hand. The monks barred all of the doors into the cathedral, making sure that the knights could not rush in and grab Becket. But as it happened, one of these knights actually knew Canterbury Cathedral quite well, and knew that there was a small side entrance that was easily penetrable, give a few hits of a weapon or a sword. Thankfully, as it happened, there had been some work done at the cathedral itself, and so a handy axe was found ready to be used to break down the doors, this little side door of Canterbury Cathedral. Becket could have hid in any one number of places within this vast space of Canterbury Cathedral. His best option would have actually been down in the crypt, below the main building itself, and probably the darkest space of all. It was, after all, late December, and the knights, of course, draw in earlier. So when the knights burst through the doors and shouted out, "Where is the traitor? Where is the Archbishop?" Becket simply stepped forward and said, "Here I am, not a traitor, but a priest of God." And he asked the knights, "Why do you want me?" The knights replied, "We want your death." Becket simply accepted the fact that he was going to die. And in another attempt to get the Archbishop to cease the decision of excommunication against these bishops of England, Becket simply refused, saying that they had given him no satisfaction to absolve them of their crimes. Fitzurse grabbed the Archbishop, probably intending to drag him outside into the streets to kill him there. But Becket clung on to the foundations of the building and the sanctity that was Canterbury Cathedral. He made one final gestural words at the knights, saying that they should be respectful and pay homage to the Archbishop of Canterbury as good loyal servants to God. But Fitzurse decided that enough was enough. He took his mighty sword and cleavered it down on top of the Archbishop's head, shearing off the top, blood and brains all over the floor. In the crossfire was one of the Archbishop's monks by the name of Edward Grimm, who was caught in this encounter by Fitzurse, and his arm was almost completely torn from his body. It was 3 strikes to the head before Becket fell to his knees and then collapsed face down onto the cathedral floor. Richard Le Breton, the 4th and final knight in this act, made one final calamitous and impassioned blow against the Archbishop, so forceful in fact that not only did it hit Becket, but it hit the stone floor of the cathedral and shattered this great knightly sword being carried. "The traitor will not rise again," said one of the knights, as the 4 of them left by the same door that they came through and escaped to Knaresborough Castle, which was owned by Hugh de Morville. It was some time before the monks, who had previously fled the scene, now began to come back and inspect what remained of Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They decided to bury Becket very quickly because rumours were starting to spread that the knights were possibly going to return. With the aid of Ranulph de Broc, the political enemy of Becket, and drag the body through the streets, showing a gesture of what happens to traitors. They decided not to wash the body of Becket as would have been customary back in the Middle Ages. And according to one source, when the monks removed the simple nightwear that the Archbishop had been wearing, they found it had been infested with lice, which apparently made Becket seem more holy, more pious than perhaps the rest of the clergy at the cathedral, and suffering in life as he had in death. Many years later, Herbert de Bossom, who had been a close companion and indeed the secretary to the Archbishop Thomas à Becket, had wrote of his great friend that, "In truth, he was great in all places, great in the palace, great at the altar, great when he was at court, and great in the church, great in his time in exile, and great in his return, and singularly great at his journey's end." News was received on the 1st of January 1171 at the court of Henry II. It is said that the king was guilt-ridden and so full of sorrow at hearing that his archbishop had been killed, despite the fact that they were at times bitter rivals and enemies. It is said that the commissioners that Henry II had sent off to arrest the Archbishop of Canterbury had arrived a day too late, and immediately, of course, sent word to the king. The king then spent the next 3 days in solitude and another 40 of reflective contemplation at the fact that his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket, had been killed. As news spread of Becket's murder throughout the Christian world, there were occasions where miracles are said to have happened in Thomas's name, from Bedford, Winchester, Rochester as well, but also as far as Cologne in Germany too. A number of these miracles are depicted actually in the stained glass windows of Canterbury Cathedral today. And with all these miracles having occurred and verified by the Church, on the 12th of March 1173, the Pope at that time proclaimed that Thomas à Becket be made into a saint. Now, what once was a great shrine to St. Thomas à Becket has since been dismantled by Henry VIII, the Tudor monarch, under his Reformation, moving away from the authority of the Pope and creating the Church of England under the King himself. But the fact is that Thomas à Becket is still revered within England, and despite a saint being a more Catholic aspect of Christianity, Thomas à Becket is the only saintly figure within the Church of England. But there are 3 relics that still survive associated with St. Thomas à Becket, located in a nearby church just past Canterbury Cathedral, and it is there that 3 of those relics were then moved. Now, as for King Henry II, he was pardoned at the Council of Avranches in a meeting with the Pope on the 21st of May 1172. He was pardoned on the condition that he would abolish the unlawful constitutions of Clarendon, and also under the condition that he would make his own penance to the shrine of St. Thomas à Becket. Unfortunately, getting to the shrine of Thomas à Becket at Canterbury Cathedral was apparently quite difficult for Henry, not least because he was going through what was known as the Great Rebellion, where his three eldest sons, his Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, in alliance with the French king and also the Scottish king at one point, rebelling against the English king Henry II. But it came in the mid-July of 1174, when things were starting to calm down, that Henry made his penance towards Canterbury. He travelled on the 8th day of that month from his court in Normandy across the Channel to Southampton and then onwards to London, apparently all in one single day. Now, possibly take that with a pinch of salt. On the 9th day, Henry then made a quick start to getting off to Canterbury, and over the next 3 days he would make significant progress. Just a few short miles from his destination, Henry II approached the township of Harbledown. From here, the real penance was to begin. Henry stepped down from his horse and walked the rest of the way for all of the town and indeed the city of Canterbury to see. He only stopped once in his last 3 miles of walking. He stopped at the church of St Dunstan, just outside of Canterbury city gates, to take off his royal regalia and replace it with a simple pilgrim shirt. Some say it was made out of linen or a woolen material. Others regarded it as a mere sackcloth. He took off his boots and walked barefoot through the city to the cathedral. Henry's feet would have been cut, torn, and even stabbed as he made the final walk to the cathedral. Arriving at the magnificent doors of Canterbury Cathedral, there were the bishops, some of whom no doubt had watched as Henry's knights murdered Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. There, alongside 80 monks from the nearby Benedictine priory, as penance, the monks were given permission to give 3 lashings each, and the bishops 5 lashings each, onto the back of King Henry II. It is estimated that nearly 300 lashings were given to Henry as penance for his crime. Finally, that night, Henry would sleep on the bare floor, the stone cold floor of the cathedral, with no blanket, having been given no food either. Henry made a speedy return back to London by the 14th of July, but was taken ill soon thereafter for the next 3 days, recovering by the 17th or 18th of July. Evidently, the punishment and the penance that he had served at Canterbury had weighed heavy on the English king. Coincidentally, on the same day that Henry was taking his penance at Canterbury Cathedral, so too were the armies of the king and the rebels under the Scottish king William were facing off at Alnwick Castle. It was a decisive victory for Henry's forces, and the Scottish king was captured, thus ending the Great Rebellion of 1173-74. But this wasn't to be the end of Henry's political turmoil. By the time of his death of 1189, he had gone through a series of rebellions by various members of his family, his sons, and of course also the Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. And now that Henry II has done his penance, and Thomas à Becket has been enshrined within the eyes of Christianity, but also within the tomes of English history, I shall conclude my video right here. Thank you for watching. I hope that you have garnered some bits of information about this very specific part of English history, about these 2 very specific people. Please feel free to click a button or do whatever you want. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video in this Pilgrim series. See you later.